Elijah Hayes, a successful black CEO, returns to his hometown to run a community center aimed at uplifting underprivileged families, only to face relentless harassment from a corrupt councilman and a racist police officer. From staged raids to baseless accusations, these powerful figures exploit systemic racism to discredit and dismantle Elijah's work, revealing the deeply ingrained prejudice and abuse of power in their small town. As the tension escalates, Elijah must confront public humiliation and systemic injustice in a fight that exposes the infuriating depths of racism in America. The quiet hum of the city was all Officer Carla Monroe could hear as she cruised the late-night streets of Red Hollow, a small town with a reputation for silence, but also secrets. In her 10 years on the force, Carla had come to understand that darkness wasn't just a feature of the night. It lived in the cracks of every system she was meant to uphold. Tonight felt different, though a single red sedan parked outside a rundown warehouse caught her attention. Its sleek design contrasted sharply with the neighborhood's abandoned lots and crumbling facades. Carla slowed her patrol car, her fingers hovering over the radio. Something about the scene tugged at her instincts, not just as a cop, but as a black woman who knew all too well how appearances could deceive. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I've got a suspicious vehicle at the old textile mill on Warren Street, license plate, November Tango 540, running a check now." Her voice was calm, professional, though her chest tightened slightly. Carla had learned to mask her unease over the years, but the memory of a similar night, one that ended in tragedy, crept up her spine like a cold wind. She shook it off, refocusing as the dispatcher crackled back. "Unit 7, plates registered to an Ian Harper clean record, no priors." "Copy that, approaching on foot," Carla replied, stepping out of her car. Her boots crunched against the gravel, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The warehouse door creaked as she pushed it open, her flashlight slicing through the shadows. At first glance, the space seemed empty, until she noticed the faint glow of a laptop screen in the far corner. "Police, anyone here?" she called, her voice firm but measured. A figure emerged from the darkness, hands raised. A young black man, no older than 25, dressed in a hoodie and jeans. His expression was a mix of defiance and fear. "Don't shoot," he said, his voice steady but laced with tension. Carla's heart sank, though her training kept her posture rigid. "I'm not here to hurt you. Step forward slowly." As he complied, Carla couldn't help but notice the papers scattered across the table near the laptop. They weren't the hastily scribbled notes of a vandal, but detailed schematics, financial ledgers, and legal documents. "What's your name?" she asked, her tone softening. "Ian Harper," he replied. Recognition flickered in Carla's mind. The name wasn't unfamiliar. It had been all over local news months ago, tied to a heated lawsuit against the city's largest corporation, Sterling Industries. Ian had accused the company of environmental negligence in his neighborhood, but the case had quietly disappeared. "What are you doing here, Ian?" His eyes narrowed, the fear giving way to determination. "Trying to find proof. The kind of proof people like me can't afford to lose." The early morning sun cast long shadows across the small town of Grayson Hill, a place where time seemed reluctant to move forward. Nestled in the heart of the Midwest, the town prided itself on its tightly knit community and traditional values. Yet, beneath its picturesque facade, cracks in the foundation hinted at the unspoken tensions that had lingered for generations. Elijah Hayes parked his understated black sedan in the gravel lot of the Bluebell Diner. The car, though sleek and undeniably luxurious, was far from flashy, a reflection of the man himself. Elijah was a prominent figure, not just in Grayson Hill, but across the nation. As the CEO of Hayes Innovations, a groundbreaking tech company that employed thousands, Elijah was a man of immense wealth and influence. Yet, you wouldn't know it from the way he carried himself. Dressed in dark jeans and a neatly pressed button-up shirt, Elijah exuded an effortless modesty that often caught people off guard. He preferred simplicity over extravagance, a trait instilled in him by his parents, who had raised him in a modest two-bedroom house on the outskirts of town. Despite his global success, Elijah made it a point to return to Grayson Hill every month, maintaining a quiet connection to the place that had shaped him. Today was no exception. Elijah pushed open the diner's door, the faint jingle of the bell announcing his arrival. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him, along with a smattering of glances from the early morning crowd. The Bluebell Diner was a relic of the town's past, a small, cozy establishment where the same group of retirees occupied the corner booth every morning, and the waitress, Clara, knew everyone's usual. But despite its charm, the diner was not immune to the town's unspoken rules. Elijah nodded politely at the familiar faces as he made his way to the counter. He could feel the weight of their gazes, not unkind, but heavy with curiosity. In Grayson Hill, Elijah Hayes was both a hometown hero and an enigma, a man who had risen far above the town's expectations, yet chose to return to its embrace. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," Clara said, her smile warm but tinged with formality. She was in her mid-50s, with kind eyes and a sharp wit that made her a fixture in the community. "Morning, Clara," Elijah replied, settling onto a stool at the counter. "I'll take the usual, black coffee and the breakfast special." "Coming right up," Clara said, scribbling on her notepad before disappearing into the kitchen. Elijah pulled out his phone and began scrolling through emails, his brow furrowing slightly as he read the latest update from his legal team. The ongoing negotiations with a powerful rival corporation had taken a contentious turn, and Elijah was well aware of the challenges ahead. "Big city problems," a voice drawled from the booth behind him, loud enough to carry across the diner. Elijah glanced over his shoulder, his expression neutral. The voice belonged to Larry Calloway, a local businessman with a reputation for being outspoken, sometimes to a fault. Larry leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he addressed Elijah. "Must be nice, coming back here to play the hometown hero, while the rest of us are out here fighting to keep our businesses afloat." Elijah met Larry's gaze calmly, his tone measured. "It's not about playing hero, Larry. It's about staying connected. This town means something to me, just like it does to you." Larry let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Sure. Just seems odd. A man with your kind of money sitting in a place like this when there are bigger fish to fry." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Elijah chose not to rise to the bait. Instead, he turned back to his coffee, taking a slow sip as Clara returned with his plate of eggs, bacon, and toast. "Here you go, Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone softer now, as if to diffuse the moment. "Thank you, Clara," Elijah said with a polite nod. As he ate, Elijah couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in the room. The way conversations quieted when he walked past, the furtive glances exchanged between patrons. It wasn't hostility, not exactly, but it was a reminder that, for all his success, he was still an outsider in some ways. Elijah had grown accustomed to this dynamic, not just in Grayson Hill, but in boardrooms and conference halls around the world. No matter how polished his suit or how impressive his resume, there were always those who saw him as an anomaly, a man who didn't fit the mold of what they expected power and success to look like. After finishing his meal, Elijah left a generous tip on the counter and stood to leave. As he reached for the door, he heard a voice behind him. "Mr. Hayes?" He turned to see a young man, no older than 20, standing near the jukebox. The kid was tall and lanky, with an earnest expression that made him seem younger than he was. "Yes?" Elijah replied, his tone inviting. The young man hesitated, glancing around nervously before stepping closer. "I just wanted to say, I really admire what you've done. You're an inspiration to a lot of us." Elijah smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "Thank you. That means a lot. What's your name?" "Dante," the young man said. "Dante Carter." "Well, Dante, it sounds like you've got big plans," Elijah said. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do." Dante nodded, his confidence bolstered by the exchange. "I won't, sir." "Thank you." As Elijah walked out into the crisp morning air, he felt a flicker of hope. Moments like these reminded him why he kept coming back to Grayson Hill, despite the challenges. But as he reached his car, he noticed something out of place. A patrol car idling a few spaces away, its lights off but engine running. The officer inside was watching him, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Elijah met the officer's eyes briefly, before unlocking his car and sliding into the driver's seat. The feeling of being watched wasn't new, but it still left a bitter taste in his mouth. As he pulled out of the lot, Elijah's mind was already turning over the possibilities. Was this just another instance of small-town scrutiny? Or was something more sinister brewing beneath the surface? He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Grayson Hill wasn't as quiet as it seemed. Elijah drove down Main Street, his hands steady on the wheel, though his mind was anything but calm. The patrol car that had been idling in the diner's lot now followed at a measured distance. He could see it in his rearview mirror, a quiet presence that seemed more deliberate with every turn he took. He sighed inwardly. This wasn't the first time he'd been shadowed through town, and he doubted it would be the last. Grayson Hill had a way of reminding people like him, black men who didn't fit the town's expectations of success, that no matter how far they rose, someone would always be watching, waiting for them to slip. As he pulled into the parking lot of Hayes Community Center, a non-profit he'd funded to provide resources and mentorship for underprivileged youth, the patrol car slowed but didn't stop. Elijah parked and stepped out, his movements deliberate as he retrieved a portfolio from the back seat. He cast a glance toward the officer in the patrol car, who lingered a moment longer before driving off, leaving behind a faint tension in the air. Inside the center, the atmosphere was a welcome contrast. The walls were painted a vibrant blue, adorned with artwork created by the kids who frequented the space. A group of teenagers clustered around a computer station, working on coding exercises, while a volunteer led a tutoring session at a nearby table. "Elijah, you're just in time," said Vanessa, the center's director. She approached him with a warm smile, her clipboard tucked under one arm. "We're finalizing the plans for the fundraiser next month. The mayor's office confirmed they'll be sending a representative." "Good news," Elijah said. Though his tone carried a trace of weariness, Vanessa noticed, her smile fading slightly. "Something on your mind?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Elijah hesitated, then shook his head. "Just the usual," he replied. "Nothing I can't handle." Vanessa nodded, her expression understanding. She'd worked with Elijah long enough to know what the usual meant. The afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and planning sessions. By the time Elijah left the center, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the town. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at the screen, a message from Dante, the young man he'd met at the diner earlier. "Thank you for your advice today, Mr. Hayes. It meant a lot." Elijah smiled faintly and began typing a reply when a sharp voice interrupted him. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." He looked up to see two police officers approaching, their hands resting on their holsters. The younger of the two, Officer Whitaker, had spoken, his tone clipped and authoritative. His partner, an older officer with a steely gaze, remained silent, but watchful. Elijah frowned but complied, raising his hands slightly as he stepped away from his car. "Is there a problem, officers?" "We received a report about a suspicious individual in the area," Whitaker said. His eyes darted to Elijah's car, then back to him. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Elijah's jaw tightened, but his tone remained calm. "This is my car. I've been at the community center all afternoon." "Do you have identification?" Whitaker asked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the evening air. Elijah reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license and corporate ID card, the latter of which bore his name and title. "Elijah Hayes, CEO." Whitaker glanced at the IDs, his brows furrowing slightly. "CEO, huh?" he muttered, as if the title didn't quite fit the man standing before him. He passed the cards to his partner, who studied them in silence. "This your car?" Whitaker asked, nodding toward the sleek sedan. "It is," Elijah replied evenly. "Registered under my name." Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line as he circled the vehicle, his eyes scanning it with exaggerated scrutiny. Meanwhile, the older officer, whose name badge read Dixon, handed back the IDs without a word. "Nice car," Whitaker said, stopping near the driver's side door. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "Yes, I do mind," Elijah said, his tone still calm but firm. "Unless you have probable cause, I believe we're done here." Whitaker's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "You've got nothing to hide, right? So why not cooperate?" Elijah took a slow breath, feeling the familiar mix of frustration and restraint simmering beneath the surface. "Officer, I respect the work you do, but I also know my rights. If you have a legitimate reason to search my car, I'm happy to comply. Otherwise, I'd like to be on my way. The tension hung thick in the air as Whitaker stared him down, his jaw working as if chewing over a response. Finally, Dixon spoke for the first time, his voice low and gruff. "Let it go, Whitaker, he's clean." Whitaker hesitated, clearly unhappy, but stepped back with a reluctant nod. "Fine. You're free to go," he said, though his tone carried a hint of warning. Elijah nodded, taking his IDs and slipping them back into his wallet. "Have a good evening, officers," he said before getting into his car. As he drove away, the knot of tension in his chest loosened slightly, but the encounter lingered in his mind. It was a reminder, one he didn't need, that his success and integrity meant little to those who saw him only as a threat. Later that evening, Elijah sat at his dining room table, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. His home was a study in understated elegance, with clean lines and warm lighting that reflected his preference for comfort over ostentation. Across from him, Vanessa sat with her own cup, her expression troubled. "That wasn't the first time, was it?" she asked, breaking the silence. Elijah shook his head. "No. And it won't be the last." Vanessa frowned, her fingers tightening around her cup. "You shouldn't have to deal with this, Elijah. Not after everything you've done for this town." Elijah's gaze drifted to the window, where the lights of Grayson Hill twinkled in the distance. "It's not just this town, Vanessa. It's everywhere, you know that as well as I do." She nodded reluctantly, the weight of his words settling between them. "So what do we do?" Elijah's eyes hardened, a flicker of determination cutting through his weariness. "We keep going. We keep building. Keep showing up. They can try to undermine us, but they can't stop us." Vanessa smiled faintly, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade entirely. "You're a better man than most, Elijah." He shrugged, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "I'm just a man trying to do what's right. That's all." As the night deepened, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the day's events were only the beginning. The encounter with the officers, the lingering stares at the diner. They were signs of a deeper undercurrent, one that seemed to grow stronger with each visit to Grayson Hill. He thought of Dante, of the young man's hopeful words that morning, and resolved to protect that hope, no matter the cost. Elijah knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but then, it never had been. Elijah's day began early the next morning, with a brisk walk through the quiet streets of Grayson Hill. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass, but the weight of the previous day still lingered heavily on his shoulders. As much as he tried to push it aside, the patrol car, the questioning, and Whitaker's accusatory tone replayed in his mind, like an unwelcome echo. He had just rounded the corner near the community center when he noticed a small crowd gathered outside the entrance. Something about their posture, stiff and uncertain, set him on edge. Quickening his pace, Elijah approached the group, his eyes scanning for clues. Vanessa was there, standing near the front steps, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. When she saw Elijah, she hurried over, clutching a clipboard so tightly her knuckles were white. "Elijah," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You need to see this." She led him to the front doors, where a bright yellow notice had been taped to the glass. The words, "Notice of violation, cease operations immediately," were printed in bold letters, stamped with the insignia of the city council. Below it was a list of alleged code violations, each more dubious than the last. Elijah's jaw clenched as he read, faulty wiring, improper permits, fire hazards. It was a litany of technicalities, most of which he knew were baseless. The center had been inspected and approved months ago, and any issues had been addressed promptly. This wasn't an accident. It was a targeted attack. "They're trying to shut us down," Vanessa said, her voice trembling with barely contained frustration. "The inspector came early this morning with a couple of officers. They didn't even give us a chance to respond." Elijah's mind raced. The community center wasn't just a building, it was a lifeline for so many in the town. Shutting it down would devastate countless families who relied on its programs. And yet, he wasn't surprised. He had seen this playbook before. Obstruction through bureaucracy, wielded as a weapon to stifle progress and silence dissent. "Who sent them?" Elijah asked, his voice calm, despite the fire burning in his chest. "Councilman Sterling," Vanessa replied, her tone bitter. "He's been after us for months, claiming we're overstepping, by offering services the town should be providing, but we both know this is about control. Elijah nodded, his gaze hardening. Councilman Sterling owned a significant portion of Grayson Hill's commercial real estate and had long opposed the community center, viewing it as a threat to his influence. This move was calculated, designed to undermine Elijah and discredit the work he'd been doing. Later that day, Elijah found himself sitting across from Mitchell Graham, the town attorney. Mitchell was a wiry man in his late 40s, with perpetually rumpled suits and a demeanor that oscillated between nervous and apologetic. He had worked for the city for over a decade, but his sympathies often aligned with those fighting against the system he served. "This is bad, Elijah," Mitchell said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Sterling's playing dirty, but he's playing within the rules, or close enough to it. If these violations hold up, they can shut you down indefinitely." "They won't hold up," Elijah said firmly. "We're compliant, you know that as well as I do." Mitchell hesitated, his eyes darting to the folder in front of him. "I know, but that doesn't matter right now. Sterling's got half the council in his pocket, and they'll back whatever narrative he spins. He's already pushing the idea that you're using the center to line your pockets or gain political leverage." Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. The absurdity of the accusation wasn't lost on him, but he also knew how easily public perception could be manipulated, especially in a town like Grayson Hill. "What are my options?" Elijah asked. Mitchell sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We can appeal the notice, but it'll take weeks to get a hearing, and even then, the odds aren't great. Sterling's got the resources to drag this out indefinitely." "And in the meantime, the center stays closed," Elijah said, his voice heavy with frustration. Mitchell nodded, his expression apologetic. "I wish I had better news." As Elijah left Mitchell's office, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Vanessa. "You're not going to believe this. Meet me at the center ASAP." 15 minutes later, Elijah arrived to find Vanessa standing near the front steps, flanked by 2 officers. Whitaker was there again, his expression smug as he watched Elijah approach. Beside him stood Officer Daniels, a towering figure with a reputation that preceded him. Daniels was known for his heavy-handed tactics and unapologetic disdain for those he deemed outsiders. "Elijah Hayes," Daniels said, his voice a low rumble. "We need to talk." "About what?" Elijah asked, keeping his tone steady. "We received a report about some suspicious financial activity tied to this place," Daniels said, gesturing toward the center. "Word is, you've been funneling money into some off-the-books accounts. Care to explain?" Elijah stared at him, incredulous. "That's a baseless accusation, and you know it. All of our financials are public and regularly audited." "Then you won't mind us taking a look," Whitaker interjected, his smirk widening. "Just to clear things up." "This is harassment," Vanessa said, stepping forward. "You have no grounds to be here." Daniels turned to her, his expression darkening. "Ma'am, I suggest you step back and let us do our job." Elijah placed a calming hand on Vanessa's shoulder, signaling for her to stay quiet. "You want to review the financials? Fine, I'll have my accountant send them over. But you're not going to find anything." Daniels stepped closer, his towering presence meant to intimidate. "You've got a lot of confidence for someone who's under investigation." Elijah met his gaze without flinching. "I have nothing to hide, can you say the same?" For a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Then Daniels stepped back, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "This isn't over," Daniels said, his tone dripping with menace. "We'll be watching." That night, Elijah sat in his home office, the events of the day swirling in his mind. The systemic pushback he faced wasn't new, but the intensity of it had reached a boiling point. Sterling, Daniels, Whitaker, they weren't just trying to undermine him. They wanted to destroy everything he'd built, to send a message that his success didn't exempt him from their scrutiny. But Elijah wasn't about to back down. He opened his laptop and began drafting a statement, one that would address not only the shutdown of the community center, but the broader issues plaguing Grayson Hill. He would call out Sterling's corruption, expose the abuses of power within the police department, and rally the community to stand with him. As he typed, his resolve hardened. This wasn't just about the center or his reputation, it was about justice, about dismantling the structures that allowed people like Sterling and Daniels to wield power unchecked. The following morning, Elijah's statement went live. It was a call to action, a challenge to the people of Grayson Hill to demand accountability from their leaders. The response was immediate. Messages of support flooded in from across the town, along with stories from others who had experienced similar injustices. But not everyone was pleased. By midday, Elijah's phone buzzed with a message from Mitchell. "Sterling's furious. Watch your back." Elijah read the message, his jaw tightening. He knew the stakes had just been raised, but he was ready. Elijah Hayes stood in the middle of his office, staring at the flurry of notifications lighting up his phone. His public statement had gone viral overnight, sparking both outrage and support. Community members rallied to his side, sharing stories of their own experiences with corruption and prejudice in Grayson Hill. But the backlash was swift too. Anonymous threats and hateful messages poured in, accusing Elijah of stirring trouble where none existed. He let out a slow breath, steeling himself. This wasn't new. He'd faced worse during his rise to the top of the corporate world. But this time, the fight wasn't about stockholders or market share. It was about the very fabric of his hometown, a place he loved, but could no longer overlook for its flaws. "Elijah," Vanessa said, stepping into the room with her phone in hand, her expression grim. "You need to see this." She handed him the device. On the screen was a video taken earlier that morning, a grainy clip showing officers raiding the community center. Furniture was overturned, documents strewn across the floor as Officer Daniels and Whitaker led the operation with smug determination. The caption read, "Hayes' Haven or Corruption Hub Police Investigate." "They've completely torn the place apart," Vanessa said, her voice tight with anger. "And the media's already spinning it like they've uncovered something big." Elijah's jaw clenched. The center was spotless, every transaction accounted for, every program meticulously documented. This was a smear campaign, plain and simple, a desperate attempt by Councilman Sterling and his allies to discredit him. "Where are they now?" Elijah asked, his voice low but steady. "Still there," Vanessa replied. "Mitchell's trying to get an injunction, but it's slow going." Elijah nodded, grabbing his coat. "I'm going down there." Vanessa reached out to stop him, concern flashing in her eyes. "Elijah, you need to be careful. They're looking for any excuse to escalate this." "I know," he said, his tone firm. "But I won't let them destroy everything we've built without standing up to them." The confrontation. The scene outside the community center was chaotic. A crowd of onlookers had gathered, their murmurs rising as Elijah pulled up. News vans were parked haphazardly along the street, reporters jostling for position. Elijah's stomach turned at the sight of the damage. The glass doors hung open, one shattered pane glittering on the pavement. Officer Daniels stood near the entrance, arms crossed, and a satisfied smirk on his face. Whitaker was beside him, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as if daring anyone to approach. Elijah squared his shoulders and strode toward them. The crowd parted, their whispers falling silent as all eyes turned to him. "Officer Daniels," Elijah said, his voice carrying across the lot. "What's the meaning of this?" Daniels turned slowly, his smirk widening. "Mr. Hayes, glad you could join us. We're conducting an investigation into financial irregularities tied to this establishment, standard procedure." "Standard procedure doesn't involve vandalism," Elijah shot back, gesturing to the wreckage. "You've destroyed property and disrupted vital services for this community, all based on unfounded accusations." Daniels took a step closer, his towering frame imposing, but failing to intimidate Elijah. "We're just doing our job, Mr. Hayes. If everything's as clean as you claim, you've got nothing to worry about." Whitaker chuckled under his breath, earning a sharp glance from Vanessa, who had just arrived. She stepped up beside Elijah, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice steady. "This is harassment," she said, glaring at the officers. "You've been targeting Elijah for weeks, and now you're targeting the center. You're not fooling anyone." Daniel's smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Ma'am, I suggest you step back before you get yourself into trouble." Elijah placed a calming hand on Vanessa's arm. "They're trying to provoke us," he said quietly. Then louder, "You've overstepped, Daniels, and you'll answer for it." Daniel's expression darkened. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only Elijah could hear. "You think your money and your fancy title make you untouchable, but in this town, you're just another troublemaker, and I'll make sure everyone sees that." Elijah didn't flinch. "I've faced bigger bullies than you, Daniels, and I'm still standing." The turning point. As the crowd swelled, tensions mounted. Reporters shouted questions, their cameras trained on Elijah and the officers. A local activist, Ms. Harper, stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This center has done more for this community than the entire council combined," she said, pointing at Daniels. "And you're tearing it down because you're afraid of change." Her words sparked a ripple of applause from the crowd, emboldening others to speak out. Daniels' face twisted with anger, his control over the situation slipping. "Enough!" he barked, his voice booming. "Everyone clear out, or you'll be arrested for obstruction." The crowd hesitated, their resolve wavering under the threat. Elijah stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "You're not going to intimidate these people, Daniels. They're here because they care about this town, because they're tired of corruption and abuse of power." Daniels glared at him, his hand drifting to his belt. For a moment, it seemed as though he might escalate further, but before he could act, a familiar voice rang out. "Daniels, stand down!" Mitchell Graham emerged from the crowd, clutching a sheaf of papers. He held them up triumphantly. "I've got the injunction, you're done here." The crowd erupted in cheers as Daniels snatched the papers from Mitchell's hand, his expression murderous. He read them quickly, his jaw tightening, before he crumpled the document and tossed it aside. "This isn't over," Daniels growled, his voice low. "No," Elijah said, his gaze steady. "It's just beginning." The cliffhanger. As the officers retreated, the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of hope and determination replacing the earlier tension. But Elijah knew the battle was far from over. Sterling and his allies wouldn't back down easily. If anything, they would double their efforts to discredit him. That night, as Elijah sat in his office reviewing his next steps, his phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was unknown, but the message was chilling. "You've made a mistake. Hayes, walk away while you still can." Elijah stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. They wanted him to back down, to fold under pressure, but they didn't realize who they were dealing with. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Tomorrow, he would hold a press conference. He would expose everything: Sterling's corruption, the police department's abuses, and the systemic rot that had plagued Grayson Hill for far too long. It was a risky move, one that could cost him everything. But for Elijah, there was no turning back. Elijah Hayes stood in the center of the town square, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It was just past noon, and a small stage had been hastily assembled in front of the courthouse A podium, and a microphone stood under the glare of the sun, flanked by reporters, community leaders, and a swelling crowd of supporters. He scanned the faces of the people gathered, a mix of hope, anger, and determination. Among them, he spotted Vanessa near the front, her eyes locked on him, radiating quiet encouragement. Mitchell lingered near the edge of the crowd, nervously adjusting his tie, while Ms. Harper stood boldly in the center, rallying the community with her presence. Elijah's statement had called for this moment: a press conference to expose the corruption that had gripped Grayson Hill. But it wasn't just a press conference, it was a reckoning. As Elijah stepped up to the podium, the murmurs of the crowd quieted. The microphone crackled as he adjusted it, his voice steady when he spoke. "Good afternoon," he began, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Today, we stand at a crossroads. For too long, this town has been held back, not by its people, but by the few who abuse their power to maintain control. I'm here to tell you that ends now." The crowd erupted into applause, but Elijah raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about me or the community center, it's about all of us. About standing up against corruption, prejudice, and systemic injustice." He took a breath, his voice hardening. "Councilman Sterling and certain members of the police department have targeted me, not because I've done anything wrong, but because they fear what this center represents: progress, empowerment, and equality." Before he could continue, a voice cut through the crowd like a whip. "That's enough!" The crowd parted as Officer Daniels strode forward, flanked by two other officers and Councilman Sterling himself. Daniels' face was a mask of barely concealed rage, while Sterling's expression oozed smug confidence. "This little stunt of yours has gone on long enough, Hayes," Daniels growled, stopping at the foot of the stage. You think you can stand here and slander the good people of this town without consequences? Elijah stepped back from the podium, meeting Daniel's glare with calm resolve. This isn't slander, it's the truth, and the people of this town deserve to hear it. Sterling stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescension. You've overplayed your hand, Elijah. You're nothing but a troublemaker who's bitten off more than he can chew. We've seen your financials, your operations. Everything about that so-called community center is suspect. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Suspect or threatening to the status quo you've spent your career protecting. The crowd buzzed with whispers, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Elijah turned to the reporters, his voice rising. Councilman Sterling has been funneling taxpayer dollars into private accounts for years, all while opposing every effort to bring transparency to this town. And Officer Daniels, he's not just complicit, he's orchestrated targeted harassment campaigns against anyone who challenges their control. Daniels' face darkened, his hand twitching toward his belt. You're playing a dangerous game, Hayes. No, Elijah said, stepping closer. You are. With that, Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out a flash drive. He held it up for the crowd to see. On this drive are records, financial statements, emails, and memos, detailing Councilman Sterling's corruption and Officer Daniels' abuse of power. Thanks to whistleblowers who've risked everything to expose the truth, we now have the evidence to hold them accountable. The crowd gasped, and Sterling's face went pale. Daniels took a step forward, his voice a low growl. You've gone too far, Hayes. Elijah didn't flinch. No, Daniels. You did. The moment you decided your badge was a shield for your hatred instead of a symbol of justice. Sterling tried to regain control, his voice sharp. You can't prove anything, this is just another one of your baseless accusations. But Elijah was ready. He gestured toward the edge of the square, where a car door slammed, and a tall, confident woman emerged, holding a briefcase. The crowd turned to watch as she made her way toward the stage. This is Emily Harper, Elijah announced, a federal investigator with the Department of Justice. She's been reviewing the evidence for weeks, and I've invited her here today to ensure that this doesn't get buried. The crowd erupted into cheers as Emily stepped onto the stage, her presence electrifying. Sterling and Daniels exchanged a panicked glance, their carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. Emily stepped to the microphone, her voice clear and commanding. We have reason to believe that multiple federal laws have been violated by individuals in positions of power in Grayson Hill. Effective immediately, we are launching a full investigation. And let me be clear, there will be consequences. The crowd surged forward, their cheers deafening. Daniel's face twisted in fury, his hand shooting out to grab Elijah's arm. You think you've won? Daniels hissed, his grip tightening. Elijah met his gaze, his voice steady. It's not about winning, it's about justice, and it's coming for you. Daniels let go, shoving Elijah back before turning to leave, his fury palpable. Sterling followed close behind, his face a mask of barely concealed panic. As the crowd celebrated, Elijah allowed himself a moment to breathe. Vanessa approached, her eyes shining with pride. You did it, she said, her voice trembling. We did it, Elijah corrected, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. But it's not over yet. They'll fight back. They always do. Vanessa nodded. We'll be ready. Elijah looked out at the town square, the energy of the moment lifting his spirits. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lighten. But as the celebration continued, a shadow of uncertainty lingered in the back of his mind. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The doors of Grayson Hill's courthouse loomed large as Elijah Hayes stepped inside, his footsteps echoing off the polished marble floors. It was the morning of the emergency hearing he had demanded. A last-ditch effort to halt the damage being done to the community center and expose the corruption running through the veins of the town. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, crackling with unspoken anticipation. Community members filled the pews, their murmurs hushed as Elijah entered. At the front of the room, Councilman Sterling sat at the defendant's table, his expression unreadable, but his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the table. Beside him, Officer Daniels loomed like a stone sentinel, his face betraying nothing but cold disdain. Vanessa and Mitchell flanked Elijah as he took his seat. Mitchell leaned in, his voice barely audible. The judge is neutral, but Sterling's people have deep pockets. Don't expect an easy fight. Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. Easy was never the goal. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, entered the room and took her seat at the bench. We are here today to address the petition filed by Mr. Elijah Hayes regarding the alleged harassment and closure of the Hayes Community Center. Mr. Hayes, you may proceed. Elijah stood, the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him. He focused on the judge, his voice steady and measured. Your Honor, the Hayes Community Center has been a pillar of this town, a place where underserved families find resources, where children discover opportunity, and where hope is restored. Yet, in the past week, it has been subjected to baseless raids and slander, orchestrated by individuals who fear progress and equality. Sterling leaned over to whisper something to his attorney, a smug grin spreading across his face. Elijah didn't falter. These attacks are not about zoning violations or financial discrepancies, Elijah continued. They are about silencing voices and maintaining control. But I have evidence to prove that the individuals behind these actions are not acting in the interest of the law or this community. They are acting out of self-interest. He turned to Mitchell, who handed him a thick folder. Elijah approached the bench and placed the folder before the judge. These documents include bank records, internal emails, and witness statements tying Councilman Sterling to the misappropriation of public funds. Additionally, they reveal a pattern of abuse by Officer Daniels, targeting community leaders who oppose Sterling's influence. The judge opened the folder, her expression neutral, as she began to review the contents. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Elijah returned to his seat. Sterling's attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to deflect from the real issue, the numerous code violations at the Hayes Community Center. Elijah shot to his feet. Those violations were fabricated, Your Honor, as part of a campaign to discredit me and dismantle the center. I have affidavits from independent inspectors confirming that the center is fully compliant. Order, the judge barked, silencing the room. She turned to Sterling's attorney. Mr. Hayes's evidence will be reviewed. In the meantime, I will hear from the defendants. Sterling stood, his confident facade cracking as he addressed the court. Your Honor, Mr. Hayes has always been a divisive figure in this town. While his intentions may appear noble, his actions have consistently undermined the harmony of our community. Elijah's fists clenched, but he remained silent, his eyes locked on Sterling as the councilman continued. And as for these accusations of corruption, Sterling added with a sneer, they are nothing more than the desperate ramblings of a man who can't accept that his ambitions have overreached. Daniel stood next, his imposing presence commanding the room. Your Honor, he began, his voice deep and unwavering. I've spent my career protecting this town. These claims against me are baseless. My only goal has been to enforce the law and ensure the safety of our citizens. Elijah's chest tightened as Daniels turned to face him directly. But men like Mr. Hayes, they don't respect the law. They think their money and status put them above it. The words hung in the air, thick with venom. Elijah rose, his voice clear and unwavering. Your Honor, this isn't about respect for the law, it's about who controls it. People like Councilman Sterling and Officer Daniels have twisted the law into a weapon, one they use to protect their power and punish anyone who challenges it. The judge raised a hand, silencing the rising tension. Enough, I've heard enough from both sides, Mr. Hayes. Is there anything else you'd like to add before I adjourn to review the evidence? Elijah hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. Just this, Your Honor. This case is about more than one building or one person. It's about whether we, as a community, are willing to stand up for what's right. I believe we are. As the judge retreated to her chambers, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Elijah turned to Vanessa and Mitchell, his heart pounding in his chest. It's out of our hands now, he said quietly. Vanessa nodded, her expression grim. You did everything you could. Suddenly, a commotion near the back of the courtroom drew everyone's attention. A man in a rumpled suit pushed through the doors, clutching a laptop. He looked frantic, his face pale as he waved the device in the air. Your Honor, the man called, drawing the judge's attention as she re-entered the room. I have new evidence. The judge motioned for the man to approach, her expression skeptical. He hurried forward, placing the laptop on her bench. "This was sent to me anonymously," he said. "It's a video, security footage from the community center raid." The judge glanced at the screen, her eyes narrowing as she hit play. The courtroom fell silent as the video began. The grainy footage showed Officer Daniels and his team ransacking the center, their actions far exceeding protocol. But the damning moment came when Daniels turned to one of his officers, a smirk on his face. "Make sure this place looks like a war zone," Daniels said, his voice unmistakable. "We need the headlines to do the heavy lifting." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Daniels shot to his feet, his face a mask of fury. "This is a setup," he shouted. "That footage is doctored." The judge raised a hand, her expression icy. "Sit down, Officer Daniels." Elijah stared at the screen, his heart racing. The truth was out now, raw and undeniable. The judge slammed her gavel, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This court will reconvene tomorrow morning to issue a ruling. Until then, the defendants are ordered to cease all actions against the Hayes Community Center." Elijah felt a wave of relief, but it was tempered by the sight of Daniels and Sterling huddling with their attorneys, their faces dark with fury. This wasn't over, not yet. As the courtroom emptied, Vanessa touched Elijah's arm. "We won today," she said softly. Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the door where Daniels and Sterling had exited. "Today," he echoed. "But they're not done, and neither are we." The next morning, the courthouse was packed to capacity. News of the explosive revelations from the previous day had spread like wildfire, and the town buzzed with anticipation. Cameras from local and national outlets lined the back of the room, capturing every moment as the judge took her seat. Elijah Hayes sat at the plaintiff's table, his demeanor calm but resolute. Beside him, Vanessa and Mitchell exchanged quiet words, their faces reflecting cautious optimism. Across the room, Councilman Sterling sat stiffly, his usual bravado absent. Officer Daniels, by contrast, glowered, his jaw set in defiance. The judge rapped her gavel, calling the court to order. After reviewing the evidence presented, including the video footage and financial documents, this court finds sufficient cause to recommend a formal investigation into Councilman Sterling and Officer Daniels for misconduct, abuse of power, and corruption. A ripple of gasps and murmurs swept through the crowd, quickly silenced by the gavel. The judge continued, her tone firm. "Effective immediately, all actions against the Hayes Community Center are nullified. The center is free to reopen, and its operations will proceed without interference." Elijah felt a wave of relief wash over him, as Vanessa reached over to squeeze his hand. Mitchell let out a quiet, "We did it." But the judge wasn't finished. As for the actions of Officer Daniels during the raid, including the apparent staging of evidence, this court refers the matter to the State Attorney General's office for potential criminal charges. Daniels shot to his feet. "This is outrageous. That footage was doctored." "Sit down, Officer Daniels," the judge snapped, her voice cutting through his outburst. "You will have your chance to defend yourself, but this is my courtroom, and you will respect it." Daniels sank back into his seat, his face red with fury, but his body language betraying his defeat. Sterling, meanwhile, stared straight ahead, his expression carefully neutral, as though willing himself invisible. The gavel came down again. "This court is adjourned." Outside the courthouse, the energy was electric. A crowd of supporters erupted into cheers as Elijah emerged, flanked by Vanessa and Mitchell. Reporters shouted questions, but Elijah held up a hand, signaling for silence. "Today is a victory," he began, his voice steady and clear, "not just for the Hayes Community Center, but for every person in Grayson Hill who has been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. This isn't just about one case, it's about creating a system that works for everyone, not just the powerful." The crowd applauded, their faces alight with hope. Elijah continued, "There's still work to be done. Corruption doesn't vanish overnight, and prejudice doesn't dissolve with one court ruling. But this is a start, a step toward accountability and justice." He paused, scanning the crowd. "To those who have supported me, who have stood by the center, who have spoken out even when it was hard, thank you. And to those who still doubt, I invite you to join us. Come see what we're building. Together, we can create a future that Grayson Hill can be proud of." The applause was thunderous, But Elijah's thoughts were already turning to the road ahead. Sterling and Daniels might be on the defensive now, but their networks of influence wouldn't crumble easily. Still, for the first time, Elijah felt the tide turning. That evening, Elijah sat alone in his office, the quiet of his home, a stark contrast to the day's chaos. A cup of tea cooled on the desk beside him as he stared at the framed photo of his parents, a reminder of the values they'd instilled in him. He had changed. The battle with Sterling and Daniels had forced him to confront not just the systemic barriers he'd always known existed, but also his own limits. For years, he had believed his success alone could challenge the status quo. Now, he understood that true change required more than individual effort. It required collective action, resilience, and a willingness to stand in the line of fire. His phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. "The kids are asking when the center will reopen. They can't wait to see you." Elijah smiled, typing back, "Tell them I'll be there first thing tomorrow." The center had always been his way of giving back, but now it felt like something more. A beacon of hope in a town that desperately needed it. Over the next weeks, the fallout from the court case rippled through Grayson Hill investigations into Sterling's finances, unearthed years of embezzlement, leading to his resignation and criminal charges. Officer Daniels faced mounting evidence of misconduct, and his suspension turned into a full dismissal pending trial. The Hayes Community Center reopened with renewed vigor. Attendance surged as more people came forward. Inspired by Elijah's stand, local leaders began pushing for broader reforms, from police accountability measures to increased transparency in city governance. Elijah became a reluctant symbol of the fight for justice. While he appreciated the recognition, he remained focused on the work. "This isn't about me," he told a reporter one day. "It's about all of us." One evening, Elijah visited the community center after hours. The building was quiet, the classrooms and activity rooms empty. He walked the halls slowly, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. Stopping in front of a bulletin board filled with photos and thank you notes from the kids, Elijah felt a swell of emotion. One note caught his eye. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes, for showing us that we can make a difference." He traced the words with his fingers, the weight of the battle momentarily lifting. This was why he fought. Not for recognition, not for victory, but for the possibility of a better future. The next morning, Elijah met with Vanessa and Mitchell in his office. They pored over plans for new programs at the center, initiatives that would expand its reach and impact. But Elijah's mind was already working on a larger vision. "We've seen what happens when power goes unchecked," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I think it's time we started building something bigger. Not just a center, but a network, a coalition of communities working together to demand better." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about taking this statewide?" Elijah nodded. "And beyond, if we can do it here, we can do it anywhere." Mitchell chuckled, shaking his head. "You never do think small, do you?" Elijah smiled, his eyes alight with determination. "Not when the stakes are this high." As the sun set over Grayson Hill that evening, Elijah stood outside the community center, watching as families arrived for a town hall meeting. The building glowed warmly in the twilight, a symbol of resilience and possibility. The fight wasn't over, and Elijah knew there would be more battles ahead. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to savor the victory. A reminder that even in the face of immense odds, change was possible. He took a deep breath, his heart steady. The road ahead was long, but he was ready, because justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey. As Elijah Hayes walked through the vibrant halls of the reopened Hayes Community Center, he couldn't help but marvel at what had been accomplished. Just weeks ago, this space had been reduced to a battlefield in the fight against corruption and prejudice. Now, it buzzed with renewed energy. Children laughing in the library, teens tinkering with robotics in the lab, and parents meeting to organize future programs. It was a testament to resilience, not just his own, but the collective spirit of a community that refused to back down. Elijah paused near a mural painted by local students. It depicted hands of every shade, clasped together beneath the words, "Stronger Together." The simplicity of the image moved him. It captured the heart of what the center represented: unity, hope, and the belief that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. For Elijah, The battle with Sterling and Daniels had been a crucible. It forced him to confront not only external injustices, but also the limits of his own idealism. For years, he had believed that personal success, achieving wealth, influence, and a spotless reputation, could shield him from the systemic inequities he knew existed. The events in Grayson Hill shattered that illusion. He now understood that true change required stepping into the fire, even when the outcome was uncertain. It demanded risk, sacrifice, and the courage to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. The Elijah Hayes who had returned to Grayson Hill months ago had been a man driven by the desire to give back, but his vision had been limited to what he could achieve within the walls of the community center. The Elijah Hayes who stood there now had a broader purpose. The fight against Sterling and Daniels had shown him that the center was just one piece of a larger puzzle, a starting point in a much bigger movement. "I used to think success would insulate me," Elijah admitted during a recent town hall meeting. "That if I worked hard enough, played by the rules, and stayed out of trouble, I could avoid the worst of what our system throws at people who look like me, but I was wrong. None of us are truly free until all of us are." These words, spoken with quiet conviction, had struck a chord with the audience. They weren't just about Elijah's journey, they were about the shared struggle of every person who had faced discrimination, injustice, or marginalization. Elijah's stand against corruption sent shockwaves through Grayson Hill. Councilman Sterling resigned in disgrace, his empire of influence crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. Investigations revealed years of embezzlement and backdoor deals, and he now faced criminal charges that would likely end his political career. Officer Daniels wasn't as quick to fall, but his reign of intimidation came to an end. The leaked video of his staged raid became a lightning rod for calls to reform the police department. Community leaders demanded oversight committees and transparency measures, forcing the town's leadership to reckon with the systemic rot that had been ignored for too long. But the fight wasn't just about tearing down the old, it was about building something better. The Hayes Community Center became a hub for advocacy, education, and reform. Workshops on civic engagement and legal rights drew crowds eager to learn how to hold their leaders accountable. Town hall meetings became more than formalities. They turned into spaces where people's voices were heard and respected. Elijah's actions inspired other towns in the region to take a hard look at their own practices. Calls for justice grew louder, fueled by the knowledge that change wasn't just a lofty ideal. It was achievable when people stood together. For Elijah, the victory was bittersweet. The center had reopened, and Sterling and Daniels had been exposed, but the cost had been high. He'd faced threats, public scrutiny, and the weight of knowing that his fight might never truly be over. And yet, he wouldn't have changed a thing. "This experience has taught me that justice isn't a destination," he said during an interview with a national news outlet. "It's a process, it's something you fight for every day, in big ways and small. It's about holding yourself accountable, as much as others." Elijah had also learned the importance of allies. Vanessa's unwavering support, Mitchell's legal expertise, and the courage of whistleblowers like Emily Harper had been critical to the fight. Change wasn't the work of one person, it was a collective effort. Elijah's story resonated far beyond Grayson Hill. It became a rallying cry for those who had been silenced, a reminder that one person's stand could inspire others to rise. He began speaking at conferences and community events, sharing his experiences and encouraging others to take up the mantle of justice. "Don't wait for permission to do what's right," he often said. "If you see something wrong, speak up. If you have the power to make a difference, use it. And if you feel like you're alone, remember you're not." These words weren't just platitudes. Elijah's journey was proof that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged. He didn't sugarcoat the reality of the struggle. Progress was slow, and the road was often painful, but he made it clear that the fight was worth it. As Elijah looked to the future, he saw a path that was both daunting and hopeful. The work in Grayson Hill was far from done, but it was a foundation he had begun forming partnerships with other community leaders across the state, creating a coalition aimed at addressing systemic inequality on a broader scale. The Hayes Community Center, once a small beacon in a single town, was becoming a model for grassroots empowerment. Plans were already underway to replicate its programs in neighboring communities, creating a network of centers dedicated to education, advocacy, and opportunity. For Elijah, this was the ultimate victory. Not just proving Sterling and Daniels wrong, but proving that a better way was possible. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah stood outside the community center, watching families stream in for an event. The sound of children's laughter filled the air, mingling with the hum of conversation. It was a scene of ordinary beauty, yet it carried extraordinary meaning. Vanessa approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Elijah, her smile warm. "You know, I think this place might just change the world," she said. Elijah chuckled softly, his gaze lingering on the glowing windows of the center. "It's a start," he replied. "But the world doesn't change on its own. It changes because people like us make it." He took a sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were many. But as he stood there, surrounded by the community he loved, Elijah felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And for him, that was enough. Elijah Hayes' story wasn't just about one man's fight against corruption. It was about the power of resilience, the importance of community, and the belief that even the smallest acts of courage can spark monumental change. It was a reminder that while the fight for justice is never easy, it is always worth it. For those watching, it was a call to action, a challenge to stand up, speak out, and never stop believing in the possibility of a better world. Because, as Elijah had learned, progress isn't inevitable, it's intentional. And it begins with us.